naturopathic doctor, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about detoxification. Now, when most people hear the word detoxification or detox, they think about, some of those fancy cleanses or detox that you see in the market. So, oh, drink these 7 days of juices, or only eat rice for the next week, or hey, take these pills, and they give you a lot of loose stool. And of course, you're going to feel a little better after those because, you're taking all the processed food out of your diet. You're focusing on eating fruits or just vegetables. And then you also, with the laxative ones, of course, you're going to feel light and empty. Your guts are, they're empty. Like you're going to feel lighter and you might lose a little weight too. But ultimately, those are just temporary sorts of things that you do. And they don't really get to the heart of what detoxification is. And that's what this webinar is all about, is helping you understand what do we actually mean scientifically when we see detoxification, and how do you really get that process working better. And so when I say detox, I'm talking about your liver function. That is the main organ of detox. But before we dive into liver physiology, we really need to talk about, well, what are toxins, how do we get them, and how do we make that difference, or who would need to do this detoxification. So every year, the average person is exposed to, and by exposed, I think we mostly mean eat, 14 pounds of pesticides, herbicides, food additives, and preservatives. And I put those all in the same class because they're all chemicals that your body has to process out. So, because of this, it's really important that we, from time to time, work on our body's ability to remove those toxins that we're eating. Keep in mind, 14 pounds, that's the size of a large bowling ball, or I don't know, probably like a 3 month old to 6 month old baby. Like 14 pounds, like you pass that pretty quickly. And like that's a lot. Can you imagine carrying that around like year after year after year? That gets to be really heavy. And so we really need to be aware of this. So, what are toxins? And what do I mean when I say that? So, I gave you a brief definition already, that it's partly the things that we eat, the chemicals we eat. But really, it's broader than that. It's anything that has harmful effects on the body. So, many things at high enough levels are toxic that we're at lower levels good. We can think of our pharmaceutical drugs in that way. At a certain dose, they're helpful for you, but at a certain dose, become lethal. And so we also think about a lot of our chemicals that we make, things like solvents and paints and all the things that we put on our lawn to make it pretty. Those could all be considered toxic. And really the importance here is that if you are not able to clear these from your body, you eventually have a build up of those toxins. And this is especially true if you have an issue with your digestive tract, because that is actually one of the main ways that we get toxins out. When you have a buildup of toxins, we refer to that as your toxic burden. How much stuff do you have kind of kicking around in your body? Now, the important thing to note is toxins are fat soluble for the most part. And so that means they go to the fatty portions of your cells and the fatty portions of your body. And so when we think about where fat is predominantly stored, it is certainly in our fat cells. So where do you get toxins from? Well, one of the biggest sources that we don't really think much about is actually from the air. Of course, we have, we all think about, oh, factories in China, or, you're burning a lot of stuff and everybody's cooking over a charcoal stove, so that's making a lot of smoke, or you're in California and there's forest fires. Like, sure, those are obvious sources, but there's a lot of less obvious things that we get exposed to on a more regular basis. For instance, exhaust from your cars. If you bike to work and you're biking along next to the cars, that's a big deal. If you live next to a freeway, you have higher exposures to not just noise pollution, but all sorts of air pollution as well. Solvents. So every time you paint your nails, you can smell that. Or you use that nail polish remover that's acetone based, and you smell those. Those are airborne toxins. Of course, heavy metals, and then, more common things like our yard products, so pesticides and herbicides used on farms, but also commonly used in neighborhoods, golf courses as well. Radiation, so whenever you go flying, you get a large amount of radiation, and then, of course, anything that you inhale. And you can think of that a little bit more commonly, household items that you might inhale incidentally. So, like when you use hairspray and you smell that, and sometimes you kind of taste it. Well, that made it to your lungs. So when we think about other sources of airborne toxins, a very common one is when you smell something off-gassing. So off-gassing is very common in our manufactured items when they're brand new. You know, they kind of have that new plastic smell. So that is actually toxic chemicals off-gassing, so basically becoming volatile or airborne, and then you inhale those, and then they make it to your bloodstream very quickly, and a main source of toxification from these sorts of things. So dioxins and PCBs, we think about xylene, that's very commonly found in plastics and new carpet. You know that new carpet smell? Oh, yep, toxic. And then styrene comes out of things like computers and then your very commonly used plastics. And that's why you never want to microwave or drink anything in plastic. A lot of people like to leave a water bottle in their car, but I always caution my patients against doing this, especially in the summer, because the longer that water sits in the plastic water bottle, especially if it gets hot, you start leaching plastics into that water or whatever it is you're going to consume out of the plastic. So at home, they did the study, the Wallace study, and we inhale over 500 environmental chemicals every day at home. So never mind what they're spraying on the golf course or living next to a freeway. This is in your own home. And that's pretty wild. So they did this with a breath analysis. So the breath is basically a super filtrate of your blood. It's one of the big ways we get things out of the bloodstream and back into the environment is by exhaling them. And they found an array of different chemicals there. And many of them were really quite well known for creating what we call free radicals. And free radicals or oxidative stress are one of the main sources of disease and aging in the body. And one of the biggest sources for me, I always point out to patients, like, hey, if you're using a lot of dry cleaning, you've got to figure out like somebody who uses organic things or non-toxic chemicals for their dry cleaning, because we do have research showing that even just one newly cleaned, dry clean suit will raise your measurable levels of trichloroethylene in your blood, and that's very quickly appreciable as well. It's not like you've been wearing the suit for the past week. It's like very instantaneous. So when we think about the home, there's a lot of other sources of toxins besides just those sorts of inhalants. A lot of it comes down to things we use every day and we don't really think about. But cosmetics, skincare, of course, if you're doing anything like drinking a lot of alcohol or if you're smoking cigarettes or other things, those are all things that we call toxins because when they end up in your bloodstream, your liver has to process them. So skincare is a really big issue and a really big sticking point, because the skin is it's the largest organ in your body and it's one of the main ways we absorb things into our body. Anything you put on your skin will end up in your bloodstream. So that's kind of a sobering thought because how many of us clean and use toxic or harsh chemicals when we clean our homes and we just do it with our bare hands? Or how many of us are using hand sanitizer multiple times a day and we're not thinking about what's in that hand sanitizer that's ending up in your bloodstream? And all of that puts a huge burden on your liver because, again, your liver has to process that. Now, I want you to close your eyes for a minute or just kind of think about what your skincare regimen looks like and how many different products you're using. It starts with your face wash, your toner, any serums you use, your moisturizer, and then any makeup that goes on top of that. That's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of things that are going to be making into your bloodstream. So the big things you want to look out for here are parabens, anything that ends in cone, like dimethicone, those are hormone disruptors, and sodium lauryl sulfate, which is very commonly found as a foaming agent. So toothpaste, shampoo, conditioners, they make a really nice foam. That's what gives you that kind of clean feeling, but they're really harmful to the body. And so it's important to find products that don't have these ingredients in there, because they are associated with hormone disruption, toxicity, reproductive issues. And so that's really a huge issue since fertility issues are on the rise in the United States. So another source of toxicity is from our water. Your city water, most of us are in city, is cleaned from major contaminants, and then it's also disinfected, like with our chlorine-based products, but they don't necessarily filter out smaller things, like, for instance, hormone breakdown products or pharmaceutical drug breakdown products. And so if you've ever read an actual water quality report from your county or from your area, they don't actually check for that much. They check for certain bacteria. They look for a couple types of farm runoff. In my area in Wisconsin, we check for radon. But other than that, they don't really look for much. And so if you're drinking water straight from the tap, you're just getting everything that was flushed down the toilet by somebody else. And that's kind of a gross thought, but also kind of horrifying to think about when you realize how many people are on different pharmaceutical drugs that you certainly shouldn't be on. And now you're getting the breakdown products of that. And so filtered water can be really important here. We also get toxicities from our food and from our soils because, anything that you spray on your crops or in your field, that's going to end up in your bloodstream as well because it's on your food. Grains soak up about 10 times as much pesticides and herbicides as fruits and vegetables. And so those tend to be something that's really important to buy organic just to decrease your overall exposure to pesticides. So your food really only is as healthy as the soil it's grown in. And so that's just the quality of the food itself. Now, when we step away from that and we look at our more processed foods, now you're going to be exposed to more and more chemicals because the more processed the food it is, the more preservatives and the more artificial additives it has to have to make it delicious and to give it that long, long shelf life. That is kind of the whole point of processed foods in the first place, is that it has a long shelf life. So a good way to avoid a lot of these issues is by, when you go to the grocery store, don't shop in the center aisles, stay around the outside. That's where all the fresh food tends to be. And that's where all the foods that look like the original food, that's where they are. So the less your thing, the food item, looks like something that grew in the ground, the more refined it is and the more you stay away from it because of, certainly for your health, but also because of the toxic exposure it provides you. So buying organic is really expensive and it's not always feasible. Not everybody has access to that and everybody has the means for it. So we always start with the Dirty Dozen. This is a list put out by the Environmental Working Group, which is a really good organization. And they put out a list every year of the most toxic fruits and vegetables or produce items. And they also have the Clean 15, which is the 15 items that have the least pesticides and herbicides on them. And so please note that these are all perfectly healthy foods that most of us probably eat on a very regular basis. And so it's really important to be aware of this. And if you can afford it, these are the ones to buy organic. So it's really important to be also aware of the exposures to your area. So this herbicide, atrazine, has some research on it. And what we found with atrazine is that long-term exposure decreases your basal metabolic rate, so how many calories you burn at rest. Participants had increased body weight, more stomach fat, and they also developed insulin resistance, which is diabetes. And they didn't even have to change their food intake or their physical activity level. And so this is a huge deal. This is an herbicide that creates obesity and diabetes. And where we find its use the most is in the Wisconsin, the Midwest area, and then kind of along through the East Coast here. And this is really the half of the country that struggles more with obesity and diabetes and these sorts of issues. And so when you think about working on your health and I need to lose weight and I've got some blood sugar issues, it's not just a matter of your own diet and exercise. It's also a matter of which sorts of toxicities or toxicants are you exposed to, because those are really a silent impact on your cellular health, and ultimately the health of your cells is going to be the health of your whole body. So other toxic sources we tend not to think about. Cleaning products. We mentioned this a little bit earlier when we talked about skin, but these are all things that are found pretty commonly, like ammonia, that's Windex. Petroleum distillates. There's a lot of petroleum byproducts, like Vaseline is from petroleum, and that's a really commonly used body product. Thinking about naphthalene, that's in mothballs, and so hydrochloric acid or sodium acetate sulfite, those are in toilet bowl cleaners. And so really whenever you're using these, you should be having a fan on, you should be wearing gloves, and we just don't tend to have that sort of precautions around our cleaners because they're just so common. We don't think about them as being an issue, but many of these are actually quite toxic and have been linked to cancer, birth defects, and other sorts of issues. So it takes about 26 seconds for any chemicals in your household, so any sort of the ones on the list before, to reach your bloodstream. 26 seconds. And so that's really quite quickly, almost faster than you can wash it off your hands if you happen to touch some of these things. And so it turns out that your exposure to air pollutants, we think about the outside ones like exhaust fumes and other particulate matter as being, the bigger issue, but oftentimes it's what's in the home. It could be 2 to 5 times higher, and sometimes more than 100 times higher than your outdoor pollutant levels. And I think the reason for this is kind of twofold. The first one, I think, is that as we've developed our home technologies, they become more and more airtight. And so you get less fresh air into your home. There's less air exchange with the outdoor air. And so things just tend to kind of build up over time within your home. But then I think the other issue is that we use a lot of products in our home. So one easy way to think about, well, am I using a lot of chemicals, is think about anything scented that you use. So start with your shower routine. Okay, so you wash your hair with scented shampoo. It's probably got some parabens and some sulfates in there. And then you use your conditioner, same thing, and your body soap. Then you get out and you follow up with some scented lotion because you tend to get a little dry. And then, you're getting ready, so you spray on your perfume. That's all chemicals. And then after that, okay, let's say it's 3 to 4 products in your hair. You turn on your Glade plug-in, and then you use a little Febreze to cover up the smell of your breakfast. And all those chemicals, they're still just floating around in your home, and you breathe them in constantly. And so that is a huge level of toxicity right within your home that you might not be aware of. So we also have internal toxins. A very obvious one is the bacteria, yeast, and fungi that live in our guts. If we have bad bugs in our gut, they are absolutely going to be creating toxins, because by nature of being a cell and being active and making a bunch of products, some of those byproducts are going to be toxic for us. Now, we also make our own toxins as part of our metabolic reactions. So our cells, as they make energy, do have some waste products like carbon dioxide. Ammonia is made in small amounts. You could think of your hormones. We even make a small amount of formaldehyde. But all of these things, your body is well equipped to deal with at the levels that our cells make it. So really, I think of these as being issues more so when we have a high toxic burden. Of course, undigested food. So if you're eating on the run, eating when you're stressed out, you're not digesting your food, it kind of just gets a little, I don't want to say putrid, but it doesn't digest well. And I think we all know that feeling of when food just doesn't sit well in your stomach. That could be considered a toxin. And then, of course, we have our more metaphysical sources like stress, unresolved trauma, and toxic relationships, I think, are a big issue as well. I mean, how many of us have a toxic relationship with the news right now? And so these are toxins that absolutely are going to impair your body's ability to do what it needs to do, and should be addressed just as seriously as any of our environmental toxins. So hopefully at this point, this is kind of enough to convince you that, like, yeah, toxic exposures are a big issue for everyone, and that you need to do something about that. So when we actually do research on people, we find that they have a large variety of toxins in the body. And so likely it's not something that we're dealing with very well. If we have the toxins in our body, it means we're not clearing them. And so it's not like that we're bad at detoxification all the time. Some people are. It's more likely an issue of there's just too much stuff to work on getting out. And that's why as we go through and we learn about what are the sources of toxins, we need to work to remove those sources so we can lower our overall toxic burden on our liver. And again, the proof for that is that when we test even newborn babies or unborn babies, we find that they're full of toxins, and so your body is just dumping these things everywhere whenever it has a chance to get rid of them. So we all have chemicals in storage, and so we looked at babies in the last slide, and this slide we look at human fat cells, because remember, most toxins are fat soluble, so that's where we tend to store them the most. And we all have dioxins and PCBs, which are known causes of cancer. And so that's a big deal, because cancer is certainly not a disease anybody wants to have. It's not a good problem. Um, and so we know that 95% of cancer is caused by diet and environment. And so you have control over both of those things, your diet to a great extent, the environment to a lesser extent, but certainly your home environment. And that can be, like we talked about, one of the most toxic places. So we also ingest, on average, 35 tons of food, so somewhere between 30 and 50 tons of food in a lifetime. And so even if that was your only toxic exposure, pesticides and herbicides are on every single food item. And then this is compounded if you have gut issues, because we have the internal toxicity and you have an impaired ability to remove toxins from your body as well. That's twofold. One, if your bowels aren't moving regularly, you're just going to reabsorb everything your liver's trying to get rid of, but also because you won't be able to absorb nutrients properly. And if you can't absorb the nutrients, your liver can't do the things it needs to do because it just doesn't have the ingredients. It's like trying to make a cake without eggs or butter. All you have is the flour. It's like, well, that's not going to get you there. So oftentimes in this situation, you have kind of what I would call muddy or murky symptom picture. And that toxic buildup kind of hides your underlying issue. So maybe your true issue is, oh yeah, you don't have very good digestion for whatever reason. So you've got some bad bugs in there. But as that starts to impair your detox ability, you're going to start to have other symptoms layering on top of that. So what started as a gut issue might turn into brain fog and more fatigue or body aches and some of those more unrelated symptoms that are actually all coming from that inability to detoxify properly. So detoxification then is one of the big things that we use in my clinic as well when patients need to lose weight. This is something that most of my patients start with detoxification, and we often will circle back to it when we need to lose weight because it focuses on the underlying issue of why many people hold on to their fat and they exercise and they diet and they're doing everything right and it just won't budge. So what happens when we lose weight is we actually aren't getting rid of our fat cells, we're just shrinking them. They have less contents. So if we lose weight without getting rid of any of our toxins that we have stored, what you do then is you just concentrate those toxins in the existing cells. And that's a sign to your body that, oh, we just got more toxic, this is bad, and it stops losing weight. And oftentimes you'll gain that weight back as your body is trying to protect itself. You have to remember the body is really smart and it's always trying to keep you alive as well as possible. And so keep that in mind whenever something's happening in your body. You don't want to fight against it. You want to try to understand why that's happening. And so that's why a lot of people kind of fluctuate in their weight and they get stuck at a set point. So you also see this with people who don't have weight issues as when they're younger, but it slowly creeps on over the years. And we like to blame it on things like hormones or your poor energy or kids or stress or whatever. But sometimes we also have to consider that it could be that toxic burden that builds up slowly over time is preventing you from maintaining a healthy weight, but is helping you dilute your toxins and store them so they're not causing things like brain damage or cellular damage or nerve issues. And so oftentimes the way to get to a healthy weight is by detoxifying rather than by dieting. So here's a list of some of the symptoms that you might experience if you have issues with detoxification. Now, not everybody, and certainly nobody experiences all of these, but all of these issues have a detox component to them. So something like muscle and joint pain or fibromyalgia always have a detoxification issue in my experience. There's also an inflammatory piece as well. And so other things like chemical sensitivities, that's somebody who doesn't do well when they have noxious chemical scents. So they go down the detergent aisle in the grocery store and they can't handle it. Maybe they get a headache, maybe they get nausea, maybe they just feel physically repulsed. That would be chemical sensitivity. And it doesn't have to be all scents that do it. PMS or hormonal imbalances, very much related to detoxification issues because your hormones have to be cleared by the liver. And so all of these things really can be tied back to detox. So I talked about the liver a lot and I promised that we'd come back to it. So here we are now. It's time to talk about what the liver does. So one of the big things your liver does is it stores stuff. And so iron, B12, and sugar, which is stored as glycogen, all get packed into the liver. And so when you're not eating, your liver will release that stored sugar to keep your blood sugar stable and energy consistent. So if you're a hangry person, you have a blood sugar issue, which ultimately then is a liver issue. And so sometimes the way to work on, blood sugar fluctuations or crashing after you eat and diabetes is actually by just supporting the liver. And interestingly, many of our herbs that work so well for regulating blood sugar have a positive action on the liver. And the most popular diabetic drug, metformin, actually also has its main activity on the liver. And so we know this to be true, both in naturopathic medicine, but also we see it conventionally. And so that's a big, big deal there. And so again, that's another way that detoxification can impact your life. The liver also produces and then secretes bile, which is one of the main uses for cholesterol. It's part of bile and also one of the main ways that we get rid of things that the liver is trying to get rid of. So all those toxins. It's the primary organ of detoxification. So it has to package things up really nicely and then it puts them into the bile and then the bile is secreted into your intestines when you eat something fatty and eventually it has to move out with your stool. So the way the liver packages things, it's called phase 1 and phase 2, which I think are great names. So phase 1 comes first, and this is mainly done by a group of enzymes called cytochrome P450 enzymes, and they change those fat-soluble toxins into something that generally is more toxic, called an intermediary metabolite. And that's kind of unfortunate, but we have to do this in order to get them processed so we can get them out into the bile. And so these phase 1 enzymes are varied genetically. And so some people who tolerate certain drugs really poorly or really well, or maybe you need a half dose or a double dose, that all comes down to these cytochrome P450 enzymes and variations there. And so we know that there's variations, and because of that, people are going to have a varied ability to do phase 1 detoxification, which means you're going to have a varied ability to deal with toxins as well. So phase 2 detoxification is the second half, and this is where we really package things to make it nice and water soluble. And we take those intermediary metabolites and finally get them nicely boxed so your liver can secrete them into the bile. And so a lot of people genetically are not very good at phase 2. So when I revitalize liver function, this is really where I like to focus and that we start, because if we just ramp up phase 1 but we don't support phase 2, you're going to create a lot of those intermediary metabolites. And that's kind of what we see here. So if we have phase 1 really, really ramped up and phase 2 is really slow, you build up in the middle. And when you build up in the middle, that's where you get those nasty symptoms. That's where you get the headache or the nausea or the body aches or what have you. And so that's a really big issue. So we start with phase 2 when we are sure that that's working well. Then we turn to phase 1 and we support that one. Most people are pretty good at phase 1. A lot of people really struggle with phase 2. And you can see that there's a lot of different nutrients, completely different nutrients required for each phase. So the other issue that we run into with detox is not just genetic issues or just overburdening, but also that toxins deplete your necessary nutrients that you need to actually detox. And that makes sense, right? You use up your ingredients. And so when we actually look at where people distribute these toxins, we find that they go all over the place, and it varies person by person. Again, part of this is going to be genetic, but part of it depends on your capability to actually deal with those. And so the higher your toxic burden, the more those toxins are going to go everywhere except for to the liver to get removed, because your body is very, very quickly going to sequester them so they can't cause any damage. So these are a bunch of different, very common medications that deplete a lot of the nutrients that are essential for detoxification. So if you're on any one of these medications, you're at risk for impaired detoxification due to nutritional deficiencies. So we've got our statin drugs on there, which help lower cholesterol. We've got our antacids. I see those causing a lot of nutritional deficiencies in my office. So those are certainly a big deal. All of your anti-diabetic drugs, they don't have listed there metformin, but metformin is a major depleter of B12. So that's a really important one. And then lots of anti-inflammatories, of course, your steroid types, but even those very common over-the-counters like Advil or Aleve can all be associated with a lot of B vitamin deficiencies. So again, if you're on a pharmaceutical, please take careful note here. So what we do to address this is we have a core restore program. It's very, very simple. It's only 7 days, so anybody can do it. You can fit it into any lifestyle. And what this is geared around is restoring healthy detoxification. So really focusing in on phase 2 detoxification first, and the ability of your liver to make good, healthy bile to get things out. So that's the elimination function. It doesn't matter if your liver does the most perfect job processing things. If you can't get them out, you're no further ahead. It's just going to end up back in the bloodstream. We also give you all the nutrients that your body needs to support those detoxifications. So when we go back a few slides, all those B vitamins, all those amino acids, all the things that you need, along with a nice clean protein and some fiber. That fiber helps bind toxins and remove them from the bowels and helps carry them out. That can also be really helpful if you have underlying GI issues. That should really come to light as opposed to just detoxification caused issues. So the program starts by removing the toxic burden. And so we have to be aware of what our exposures are in our life and remove those. And then we also have to restore the liver's function. That's step 2. And so making sure that we're getting them out of the body. the last step is revitalization. And so that's where we really have to make sure that we support a healthy diet and we're doing things that are going to give us that long term success. So we're going to be doing this in my clinic. We're going to be starting on January 15th. We have a big kickoff class. We're going to talk a little bit more about the biochemistry of things and what to expect, what you're going to feel, and kind of how to navigate the 7-day detox, since this is going to be the first time for a lot of you. Um, and then we're also going to be having a daily email from me. We're going to have a Facebook group where we can talk about if you need any support from me. I'm going to be doing this with you guys because I feel like that's where you get the best experiences when you live things. I've done this before. It always works great. So I'm really excited to be doing this with you guys. We're also going to do a closing meeting. I believe education is really important. And so I want to talk with our participants about, well, how do we keep feeling this good? What do I need to do? Do I have to stay on this forever? Hint, the answer is probably no. But what habits can we take forward and how do we implement those so that you can take what you've gained from the Core Restore program and take that forward for the rest of the year? So if you're interested in doing this with me, I do have limited space, so please let me know as soon as possible. You can start the conversation, either by giving us a call or sending us an email. You can also just leave a comment on the video and I'll reach out to you and we'll get you started. So again, I hope you learned something valuable here and you learned a little bit more about detoxification. And I look forward to having you guys join me for our detox starting January 15th.